Holland Smith was with Turner at Macon, and his responsibility went further than his direct presence would indicate. Had General Julian Smith's troops been pushed off Tarawa, unless the failure was caused by deviation from plan, Holland Smith would again have been held responsible. But he did not have to worry about the Japanese fleet, or the Japanese submarines, or the Japanese planes. These were Navy worries, and so his criticisms of naval amphibious operations had to be judged within the framework of his responsibility. It was as at the Marshalls, when Admiral Hill went in to take Eniwetok after the primary target islands had been secured. By the time Hill's force reached the strongly defended Parry Island, he did not have sufficient ammunition on his ships to give the kind of bombardment that would have been most effective. Also, because of the failure of command of the army troops in that expedition, the tired men of the 22nd Marine Regiment had to take Parry directly after their assault on Engebe. Eniwetok, then, was certainly not an example of the best possible manner of staging an amphibious assault, but it was an example of what Nimitz and King prized far beyond masses of materiel and fleets of ships and armies of men, the ability of a commander to make the best of what he had and to win. Nimitz went on to the Marshalls on April 7th for inspection, taking Lockwood, Pownall, Forrest Sherman and several other officers. There was the usual Nimitz plane trouble. The staff plane had to turn back with engine trouble, but shortly after landing they were off again in a PB-2Y. At Kwajalein, Nimitz and his admirals looked over the blockhouse area and the before and after pictures, which showed what a naval bombardment could do. The before pictures, taken on January 31st, showed 40 or 50 buildings nestled among the palm trees, with a system of roads leading around the area. The after pictures showed 4 recognizable buildings still standing, and not a palm tree in the blockhouse area. Nimitz looked around with grave interest. The correspondents were there that day, in a circle around him. "What do you think of the island?" came the question as the reporters raised their pencils. "Gentlemen," said Nimitz, "it's the worst scene of devastation I have ever witnessed except the Texas picnic." The impressive victory had been accomplished by planning, hard work, and instant decision, even when the decisions were hard to make, so it was all the way down the line. General Watson at Eniwetok would remove an artillery commander because, when the chips were down, he was not getting the job done. Admiral Hill would remove a sub-chaser commander in action, because that officer had made a serious mistake in taking station in the wrong place and confusing the transport captains, who were told the ship would be elsewhere. On a higher level there was the disappearance from the Pacific scene of Admiral S.P. Jinder of Task Group 58.4. Mark Mitcher came back from a furious round of airstrikes in April and complained to Admiral Towers that he did not like the way Jinder was handling his task group. Towers went to Nimitz, who did not hesitate. Mitcher was told to order Jinder back to Pearl Harbor, for there was no time to waste on personalities. Yet Nimitz was never precipitate. When Jinder came back to Pearl Harbor in mid-April, Nimitz conducted a thorough investigation, with Pownall and Towers, into the reasons for his removal. Towers finally said Jinder's services here had been unsatisfactory. Only then did Nimitz indicate to King that Jinder's fate was to be placed back in the hands of the Bureau of Aeronautics, and he was to be removed from the Pacific. As for Holland Smith, he was unhappy in the spring of 1944 because Spruance was promoted to 4-star admiral as a result of the Gilberts and Marshalls' victories, and Turner was promoted to vice admiral, while he, Holland Smith, remained a major general. King was not enthusiastic about promoting Smith, but General Vandergrift, then Commandant of Marines, was very firm. As a last resistance, King said Nimitz had not recommended Smith's promotion, whereupon Vandergrift insisted that King ask Nimitz, which he did. Nimitz recommended the promotion. To move ahead against the Japanese meant growth, and growth was underway throughout the Pacific War effort in 1944. Growth meant change, and apparently change meant almost endless minor conflicts. Admiral McCain in Washington wanted to get back into the war, feeling that his friends in the Pacific were seeing all the action while he was flying a desk. With the wind-up of the South Pacific operations, Fitch would be more or less out of a job, and Halsey and Nimitz suggested that perhaps he go to Washington to replace McCain, who could come out and have the task force he wanted. But Artemus Gates, Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Air, was very much opposed to this change. The Navy was fighting for money, and literally for its life, in a Washington where the Congress was bombarded by demands for a universal service, and particularly an air force that took over all aspects of air operations. Gates penned a note to Forrestal stating that the change does not make sense. Gates had no animosity toward Fitch. He did not want to upset the apple cart with Congress. McCain had learned his way around and was effective before Congress. Gates was afraid that Fitch's inexperience in Washington would hurt the Navy cause. But there was another reason, part of the only conflict. Fitch was recent in naval aviation, Gates said, and his appointment as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, Air, would not be popular with the young aviators. With the progress of the war, the naval airmen were becoming convinced that theirs were the essential factors of victory, just as Holland Smith was convinced that Nimitz was riding to fame on the shoulders of the Marines. How very complex the war had become was indicated in May, when Nimitz journeyed once again to San Francisco to meet King and settle basic matters of policy for the Pacific. The meeting began on May 5th. First was the problem of the South Pacific, now that operations had slowed down there. Halsey, Nimitz and King discussed the future, and it was agreed that Admiral Newton, who had been displaced by Towers as Nimitz's deputy, at the insistence of the airmen working through Forrestal, should become the new commander of the South Pacific. King wanted him also to have a fleet command under Nimitz. Other personnel changes included the decision that Captain Moore would give way to Rear Admiral Art Davis, following the principle that the non-air spruants must have an airman as Chief of Staff. Another change was the replacement of Captain Preston Mercer, Nimitz's flag secretary, who would get a sea command, by Captain B.L. Austin. Mercer, who had been with Nimitz a long time, wanted his chance to win flag rank. The moment was also suitable because Mercer had antagonized Admiral Towers, who a few weeks earlier had asked Nimitz to get rid of the captain. Mercer's removal from the staff would be accounted a particular loss by the public relations men, for he was often their interlocutor in disagreements with Naval Academy philosophers. On many occasions Mercer had gone to bat for the correspondents and the public relations men to get information through the censors, bearding Sock McMorris and even Towers and Nimitz at times. When the personnel problems were resolved on this first day of meetings, Nimitz and King brought several other officers into the sessions to discuss general strategy and tactics. They included Admiral Cook, King's deputy, Admiral Carney, Halsey's chief of staff, and Admiral Sherman, Nimitz's plans officer. With the changes that were coming, Nimitz wanted a clear-cut break with the MacArthur command. MacArthur would assume responsibility for all operations west of the 159th meridian. It had been suggested in the personnel sessions that Admiral Newton would be responsible to MacArthur for bases and to Nimitz for fleet operations. Admiral Cook agreed with Nimitz that this idea was unsound, and particularly that Halsey should be detached with his Third Fleet from any concern with the South or Southwest Pacific. The South Pacific was to be greatly reduced, and most of the bases and personnel were to pass to MacArthur's Navy, now the Seventh Fleet under Admiral Kincaid. Following the spring decisions of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in favor of the Central Pacific Drive, Admirals King and Nimitz were now talking about the move into Formosa, which would come after the Marianas Campaign. The commander, they agreed, would be an army officer, because Formosa was the largest land mass they had encountered. The Marines were designated as shock troops. Their established mission had been to take beachheads and small areas and hold them until garrison troops came along. Formosa was seen as a land operation as soon as the amphibious forces had secured the beachheads, and the Navy had guaranteed the safety of the air and seas around the big island. On Formosa, Marines would again storm the beaches, but once the foothold was established, the Army would take over. Holland Smith, of course, was not aware of this strategy. They discussed the Japanese fleet, so badly mauled in its recent encounters with the Americans, such as at Truk. King said he thought it unlikely that the Marianas invasion would bring the fleet out to fight. but that a Formosa operation certainly would. Admiral Cook had been instructed to prepare a discussion of Pacific strategy after the Marianas, and on the second day of the meetings it was brought out. In Washington there was much discussion that spring of the MacArthur plan to retake Mindanao. What would happen if the United States bypassed Mindanao? Nimitz and Halsey said there would be hell to pay. They had been visiting MacArthur recently. But Cook's planning was based on King's thinking, and here is how it went. China operation appears bigger than Formosa in that major Japanese forces, army, will be met. China operation similar to Tunis operation. If Atlantic War ends by October 1944, and in keeping with combined Chiefs of Staff desire to end Pacific War 12 months after defeat of Germany, we should get to China before 1945. Best time to hit Formosa is probably November-December 1944, and, since present plans call for Formosa in February 1945, better check and plan for possibility of speeding up operations. If China-Formosa operations are speeded up, we may be able to do Formosa with less than 12 divisions, as preliminarily planned by SINCPAC, say 7 divisions. Important thing is to investigate possibility of earlier Formosa, together with plans for what comes after Formosa. After? Admiral Cook suggested at this meeting that the last step in the defeat of Japan would be to cut the island kingdom off from the mainland, to bombard the empire, and perhaps even to invade Kyushu. That meant that operations to cut off Korea would be treated as amphibious operations. As for the work on the China mainland, it would make major use of Chinese manpower. The Navy would take positions along the Chinese coast to supply the Chinese with arms and materiel, and use the Chinese land force to roll up the Japanese army. The conferees proceeded then to discuss the possible points where they could make entry into China. They did not know, but they did know how to find out, and King directed that General Stilwell in Chungking be asked to provide the information. Nimitz suggested that Stilwell be asked to send someone to Pearl Harbor for conferences, then come on to Washington to report the tentative decisions of the Nimitz Command. The man whose advice they really wanted was Commodore M.E. Miles, head of the Naval Advisory Group in China, and more familiarly known as Commodore of the Rice Paddy Navy. One of Miles's major responsibilities was naval intelligence. His coast watchers and spy network had been collecting information for just such a purpose for the last 2 years. So the naval planners, in deadly seriousness, began their preliminary work for the invasion of the China coast that would lead to the bottling up of Japan and the eventual defeat of the enemy. The admirals turned then to logistical and administrative problems. But the next day, having individually considered the matters at hand, they came back to strategy. Nimitz suggested the substitution of Amoy for Formosa in the initial stages of the operations. The question of Russia came up, and Nimitz suggested that they must assume the USSR would not enter the war. King suggested in turn that the Russians had a score to settle with Japan dating back to 1905 and probably would do so. Cook suggested the Russians wanted Sakhalin Island. This departure led to discussions of the Kuriles, the Netherlands East Indies, and the southeastern Asiatic continent. But it all came back to China. King explained that the Chinese government had agreed at the Cairo conference to provide 30 divisions for the renewed war against Japan, and eventually to put forward 90 divisions. All this demanded supply by the United States and bases, since so much could not be brought in over the hump of the CBI, China-Burma-India Theatre. Nimitz repeated that he believed the best way to go in was up the coast, and to launch major operations from the Shanghai area. King and Nimitz then returned to their respective headquarters, and Nimitz stepped into a hornet's nest. Towers and McMorris had been quarrelling while he was away. The aviators of the Pacific Fleet were still restless. One reason was the case with which Army aviators were receiving medals, air medals for a handful of missions flown, distinguished flying crosses by the score. Navy flyers simply did not get such awards. They were lucky to receive a letter of commendation, except for some unusually gallant or effective action. The pilots were constantly complaining to their commanders, who complained to the carrier captains, who complained to the task group commanders, who complained to Admirals Mitcher, Pownall and Towers. In Nimitz's absence, a conflict had arisen between Towers and McMorris over awards. The goat of the argument was Lieutenant James E. McNamara, Jr., the unfortunate awards officer of the Pacific Fleet Staff. Several members of Towers' staff had recently been on his back, and the result was that almost immediately on his return from the West Coast, Nimitz had to step in. He called a special meeting in his office and brought in Captain Mercer, Admiral Towers, and 2 members of Towers' staff who had been complaining. If they had any complaints, Nimitz said, they should bring them to the proper source, Nimitz. He took total responsibility for awards. That astringent conference ended the argument for the moment, but the aviators went away grumbling, as usual, that Nimitz was unsympathetic to their position, while in fact he had been raising the question of awards and recognition time after time with King. In the meetings just past, the question of awards for aviators, line officers and staff officers who were doing excellent work outside of combat areas had been discussed very thoroughly. Nor was King unaware of the problem, but his approach was to keep the bars of the Navy up so that awards would continue to have special meaning and persuade the Army and the Air Forces to stop debasing the whole procedure by giving out medals as though they were chewing gum. Another problem, now that the Central Pacific Offensive was moving at full speed, was the demand made on Nimitz's time, and that of his admirals, to keep up the momentum they had created. "We should have done much better than we did," said Admiral Harry Hill, looking back to a quarter of a century later. "But we simply did not have the time for the paperwork." Hill, for example, arose early in the morning and worked far into the night. When the Gilbert's operation was ended, he hurried to Pearl Harbor to plan for his part in the Marshall's campaign. There were action reports and a dozen other reports to write, and one of them could take time away from the planning, because in the plans lay the kernels of men's lives. Hill, for one, liked social life and exercise, but during the war he did not go to parties, and his recreation was limited to an occasional game of golf when he was in Hawaii. It was the same for the others, except that some wondered if terrible Turner ever relaxed. But as for awards, the captains who rowed their ships in these operations did not get medals. How does one equate 4 days off a beachhead with air missions? Certainly there was grumbling through the fleet about the lack of recognition, but that was the way it was. At the time of the Nimitz-Towers dispute over awards, other issues were in the air. The aviators had been pushing for public relations credit for their activities, and Nimitz had been holding fast to his doctrine of avoiding aid to the enemy at all costs. The Pacific correspondents, quick to catch innuendos, had come to recognize the existence of schism in the command, and at a dinner on Ford Island for the war correspondents one night while Nimitz was away, a correspondent had asked Preston Mercer, "Which camp do you belong to?" Mercer had reported this question to Nimitz, who was not at all pleased. Today he laid down the law. He did not want Admiral Towers to take any further cognizance of awards or of public relations. He, Nimitz, would take personal responsibility on these subjects. Camp referred basically to the problem of black shoe versus brown shoe, and officers on both sides had become steamed up enough about the situation as it developed to create many problems for King and Nimitz. With aviation coming into its own, the line officers were becoming disturbed by what they saw developing around them. Captain C. Moore, Spruance's chief of staff, later expressed the line officers' feeling very cogently when asked about the rapid rise of a certain aviator who had never seen duty on a big ship other than a carrier. He was a flyer? Well, that's astounding, the way these aviators go. They can command air squadrons based on tenders, and maybe have a tour on a carrier as commander of an air squadron, and then if they're lucky they'll get command of a deep draft ship. It will be the first really seagoing experience of their lives, to command a tanker or a supply ship or a tender, and that will qualify them for command of anything, although they've never been through the process of officer of the deck, division officer, or head of department of a ship at all. They've been aviators all their lives, and then they suddenly come to command rank and they've got to get some seagoing experience. So they put them in a tanker for a year, and then they give them command of a 50,000-ton carrier, and they terrify everybody else in the same ocean. Despite these tensions on the command level and the grumbling on the operational levels, line officers and aviators generally worked very cheerfully toward their common goal when specific tasks were to be accomplished. In the planning for the Marianas operation, Admiral Hill was eager to try some innovations. One was the use of mortars on LCTs, which could be used for close-in fire support on the beaches. When Hill went to Turner with this plan, the latter was very sceptical, but in his honest, gruff way, he did not tell Hill to jettison the idea. Turner was difficult at all times with his subordinates, but he respected independence of thought more than any other quality, and so Hill had his way. 4 mortars were installed port and 4 starboard on 3 LCTs. Unfortunately, before they ever got into action, 2 of them blew up in an ammunition explosion, and although the Court of Inquiry found it to be a handling accident, with responsibility at the lower echelons, Hill was shaken by the deaths of a number of enlisted men, and the mortar experiment was quietly dropped. All Pearl Harbor was shaken on May 21st, when 5 LSTs loaded with ammunition went up in flames in a series of earth-shaking explosions. So awesome was the sight that in describing it in his diary, Admiral Towers wrote with the vivid language of a correspondent relating a military action. For a few hours all Pearl was very tense. It was not even certain that Operation Forager, the Marianas, would not have to be delayed because of the shortage of LSTs. But in the end, 2 needed LSTs were shanghaied away from Halsey in the South Pacific, and the schedule was maintained. On the eve of the Marianas operation, Nimitz was, as usual, sorting out the multifarious problems of his divided command, and somehow keeping it relatively homogeneous. The frictions between Admiral Hoover, Nimitz's land-based air commander, and the Army Air Forces continued. Hoover was busy building canteens and officers' clubs at Kwajalein and trading his jewellery with the natives. Yesterday Bernhard and I paid a visit to the big martial chief on Eiling Lapalap Atoll. We exchanged gifts. Theirs consist entirely of grass mats, baskets, fans, etc. He was, in a way, the first island administrator in addition to his other duties. But Hoover's other duties were the ones that caused Nimitz and Generals Richardson and Arnold considerable difficulty. The Marianas planning problem was creating difficulties for the land-based air command, as a reason for taking the Marianas was to establish bases for the B-29S to bomb Japan. The coming of B-29S meant the bringing of a new air force, the 20th, into the Pacific, and a consequent reorganization of Air Force setup there. The complications were tremendous. In May, the War Department suggested that General Harmon, the commanding general of Army Air Forces Pacific Ocean areas, ought to be under General Richardson, the commanding general of the Army for the Pacific Ocean areas, when it came to logistics and administration. But as far as operations were concerned, Harmon was to be under command of Nimitz. Harmon wanted to be responsible to Nimitz for operations, to Arnold in Washington for matters in general, and to Richardson for administration and logistics. Nimitz did not want anything of the kind. The Navy organization made the Commander of Air Forces, Pacific A, Type Commander. That is, the Type Commander was an administrative officer, concerned with the administration and logistics of the air forces of the Pacific Fleet, but not actually with operations except in the planning and review of them. The Army had no equivalent organization, and this, of course, was the problem. Harmon, who was used to exercising command, would not take easily to being a type commander. Nor would he like the alternative under the Navy system, which would be to place himself under Admiral Spruance, who was commander of the Central Pacific Forces. This problem was the type that Nimitz took to bed with him at night, and in this matter the Admiral was as nearly caustic as he ever allowed himself to be. While I realize that the ambitions of the Army Air Forces may require that, particularly after the end of the war with Germany, they have complete independence from the Army ground forces in the Pacific, I prefer to retain the present system wherein I have only one commanding general to deal with. I hope that I may be spared the task of coordinating the Army Air Forces and the Army ground forces, a task which will be mine if Harmon is set up independent of Richardson. But in the very next paragraph, lest he be misunderstood by people who dealt in personalities, Nimitz hastened to add that he would be very pleased to have Harman as commanding general of the army in his area. He just did not want two co-equal army commanders to deal with. On the next lower echelon, the Army Air Force's problem was also troublesome this spring. Hoover reported that Hale wanted to set up his headquarters on Saipan, while Hoover intended to set up his headquarters on Guam. McMorris thought they ought both to be on Saipan. Nimitz said no, they should be on Guam, so they could not get mixed up with the 20th Air Force. These worrisome concerns of the Commander-in-Chief of the fleet were scarcely known to commanders other than those directly concerned. One of Nimitz's most important attributes as a successful commander was scarcely observable: the creation of a climate in which his subordinate commanders could operate efficiently. The most important of these subordinates at the moment was Admiral Spruance, whose every faculty was focused on the winning of this war. Spruance was not an easy man, even for Captain Moore, a friend from the days when they served together in the Philippines on the old Bainbridge, DD-1. A case in point: after Kwajalein and the successful Truk raid, part of Spruance's force moved to make carrier attacks on Saipan, partially to destroy, partially to secure aerial photographs for the coming invasion planning. But as this force had moved in towards Saipan, they were sighted by the Japanese. Miles away on the flagship, Spruance and Moore were following the action by radio, and Moore asked if, in view of the sighting, Spruance did not want to call off the Saipan raid, because the surprise element was missing. "No," said Spruance indignantly. That was all he said. Another officer might have been hurt and retired into his shell, not Moore, who was the perfect chief of staff for Spruance. Moore worked from 6 o'clock in the morning until midnight every day, preparing the plans and papers for his commander. Moore handled all the detail. And how did Spruance react? Did he appreciate it? "Yes, I think he did," said Captain Moore. "But under certain circumstances he could be extremely abrupt and extremely disagreeable. I never let that bother me very much. If I had something to say to him, I said it. He knew what he was going to do, and there was no fooling." The no fooling came on February 22nd. That night, Mitcher's force was attacked 4 times by Japanese planes, without any damage whatsoever, and the raid on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam was immensely successful. On that same return voyage to Kwajalein, there was another incident. Spruance carried a Japanese language officer on his staff, Commander Slonim, who did not stand watches, but spent much of his nights listening to Japanese intercepts and radio intelligence. If he found something unusual, he would wake up Captain Moore to discuss the matter. On the way back to Kwajalein, the New Jersey's radar picked up an unidentified aircraft. Slonim worried a while with the report, and then went to Moore and woke him up. Moore worried a while, and then went in to wake Spruance, who had gone to his cabin at about 8 o'clock as usual. Spruance did not like to be disturbed at night at sea unless something big was up. Moore knew it, but he was troubled this night, since they had left the task force and were heading back only with their destroyer screen. So Moore went into Spruance's darkened cabin and awakened the Admiral. "Well, is there anything I can do about it?" Spruance asked. "No." "Then why wake me up?" Whereupon Spruance turned over and went back to sleep. If Spruance was curt, it was because he valued his sleep almost as much as he valued exercise. He felt both were essential to his well-being. His point was that as commander of the Fifth Fleet, his basic task was to make the proper decisions at the proper time, and to do so he had to be clear-headed and thoroughly alert. This attitude went back to the days of the old Bainbridge in Philippine waters, when Spruance had been commander of the destroyer, with Ralph Hackstoon as his executive officer and Moore as chief engineer. Hackstoon and Moore were devil-may-care young officers who liked to go on parties, and in these days, before the day when Josephus Daniels dried up the Navy, they drank cocktails in the wardroom every night before dinner. Every night they would hand the shaker to Spruance, and every night he would sniff it, shudder, and speak up. "I am glad I am not a slave to the demon rum," he would say, back at Kwajalein and then at Pearl Harbor in March, April, and May. Spruance and his staff were almost completely occupied by the planning of the Marianas operations, in spite of Moore's suggestion that the Marianas be bypassed. It was, of course, a truism among the naval officer corps that they might suggest any idea, but when a command came from above, they turned their hands to making the operation successful, without regard to their personal beliefs. Moore's memo on Truk and the Marianas was making its way around among the concerned parties. Spruance made sure that Admiral Turner got a copy of it, although Spruance never commented on the memo himself. Spruance and his staff spent much of March at Majuro in the Marshalls, an island with a big lagoon and a lovely sandy beach. They walked and swam and worked, and sometimes visited the native villages. Spruance went to Pearl Harbor for conferences, and returned with a gaudy pair of swimming trunks. Others of the New Jersey swam in the lagoon, but Spruance contented himself with walking the deck in his trunks and ragging Captain Moore to exercise with him, while Moore quietly bemoaned the fact that Spruance flatly refused to pay any attention to details. On March 21st, Spruance received orders to raid the Palau group, to clear the area of Japanese power, so that MacArthur might move handily along the north coast of New Guinea to Hollandia. It was really a carrier raid, but Spruance went along as commander of the 5th Fleet to supervise the 3 carrier groups and 6 of Ching Li's fast battleships, along with 13 heavy and light cruisers and 26 destroyers. To the Japanese, the force must have been reminiscent of what they had been able to put forward at Pearl Harbor and at Midway. Pownall was no longer with them on this raid, but they used a plan he had devised for handling the carrier group. The New Jersey, the flagship, ran in the center of the formation, with a carrier group on the port bow, one on the starboard bow, and one astern, all, of course, outside the flagship's destroyer screen. There was only one problem: launch of planes, when the carrier groups would sometimes be completely out of touch as far as visual signaling was concerned, and Spruance was very definite in his insistence that radio silence be maintained. In his usual fashion, Spruance had his staff work up the orders, looked them over carefully, and issued them a day before sailing. These were such clear orders, and so explicit that very little else was needed except to reflect the changes Spruance made in the plans to fit the changing tactical situation. Such a change became necessary when they were spotted 3 days out by the Japanese. Then Spruance moved the day for operations against the Palaus up a full day, hoping to catch the Japanese before they moved their ships out. To aid the force, Nimitz had Lockwood send out 7 submarines as lifeguards for the pilots and to attack any Japanese shipping moving to escape the area. As usual, the submarines performed with skill and gallantry. The Tullabee was sunk when one of her own torpedoes made a circular run, but the Tunny torpedoed the Japanese battleship Musashi, causing her considerable damage. As for the carrier strikes, with the loss of about 25 planes, they swept the islands for 2 days, hitting ships, airfields, installations, and planes on the ground. Heading back to Majuro, Spruance came flat up against the new public relations policy of the Navy, the one Nimitz had described to Halsey as being forced down his throat. On March 30th, the Pacific Fleet Command had issued a communiqué announcing the attack on the Pallas. On the way back to Majuro, Spruance began getting requests, then demands, for further information about the success of the strikes. He ignored them. Spruance's position on such requests was to honour them only under the most exceptional circumstances. Then he would put a dispatch aboard a destroyer, send it out 50 miles on the flank, heading in a different direction, and let the destroyer transmit the message, or put it on a plane, and let the plane give it to a shore station. Also, the claims of the Navy and the Army in the first days of the war had been excessive, and Spruance refused to accept his own aviators' claims unless there was proof. It was not a question of dishonesty, or even intentional exaggeration. In the heat of battle, the pilots often mistook the nature of the ships they attacked and the damage they inflicted. On this homeward trek, as the requests grew ever more insistent, Captain Moore became agitated and asked Spruance if he was not going to do something about the messages. Spruance simply cocked an eye at him. "No," he said serenely, "I'm not going to tell them anything." And he did not. Only when they reached Majuro, and when the aviators' reports had been sifted and compared and checked by the commanding officers, was the dispatch sent off. Then and only then could Captain Waldo Drake and Lieutenant Commander McArdle prepare the press release that spoke of the raid on the Palaus, Yap, Ulithi and WWII, and told of the 2 destroyers, the combat ship, 2 large cargo ships, 6 medium cargo vessels, 8 small cargo vessels, 3 large, 1 medium and 1 small oiler, lesser ships and still lesser ships, ground installations, and planes destroyed. On the surface, the Palau raid seemed to have been tremendously successful. Captain Moore thought not. He was indignant because Nimitz had sent one of his staff down to Halsey in Noumea with instructions to plan for some air reconnaissance over Palau. The plan called for Halsey to send planes up on a night mission, drop flares, photograph the area, and pass on the photos immediately to the Fifth Fleet en route, so Spruance might have an idea of his targets. But the result was to spook the Japanese, who began to scatter, and to reduce the effectiveness of the raid. Moore was excited about it. Spruance refused to get excited. That was what made him such a great man, Moore suggested. The result of this raid was that Moore, the Black Shoe, came back with enormous respect for the flyers. "We get them to where they want to go and turn them loose, and then bring them home," he wrote his wife. "They do the fighting and beat off the enemy attacks, and they do it thoroughly and well." Moore, taking his cue from Spruance, was not so sure of the ability of the surface ships to perform as well as the aviators. The ships were suffering from constantly changing personnel as the fleet burgeoned, and from lack of training, whereas, said Moore, the Japanese should have reached perfection. The leavening factor seemed to be the overwhelming might that the United States could place in force. Moore was concerned particularly about the battleships, and 2 or 3 times on this voyage he had tried to give Ching Lee a chance to move his battleships out as a tactical unit to practice how to stay closed up in column, how to make simultaneous turns, how to concentrate gunfire on a target. He and Spruance were particularly concerned about Lee's readiness for a night fight, for the Japanese could be more than fearsome at night, with their high degree of training. Early in April, Spruance got the word from Admiral Jacobs that he could not continue to delay the change in Chief of Staff. Perhaps one reason for Spruance's success as a naval officer was his ability to keep his neck well protected, except on those occasions when he felt it was important to stick it out. A case in point was Spruance's failure to push for Captain Moore's promotion. When Spruance received his 4th star, it was obvious to all, including Moore, that a captain could not much longer persist as Chief of Staff to a full admiral. Such things denied the importance of rank and outraged Navy protocol. But Moore could not understand why Spruance, who had chosen him and who was obviously pleased with Moore's performance, would not push for his promotion. Moore was well aware of the personal antipathy of King, dating back to his days in the Atlantic Fleet, but he was not in a position to know that for many months King had been insisting upon the need of a replacement for Moore, and that the argument of the aviators had settled his fate. It was a difficult problem for Spruance, for he did not like change in the men around him, or for that matter to have very many men close around him. Moore suited him to a T. Their relationship, bonded by the comradeship of the Navy Club, transcended that of admiral and captain. Moore could write to his wife that one reason he was sorry to leave Spruance was that he won't get another chief of staff to do all his work for him and give him hell when he needs it. The relationship worked both ways. Moore was slender, even skinny, and since the chairs in the Admiral's cabin in the New Jersey were huge overstuffed leather club chairs, too big for him, he tended to nestle in them, cuddling his feet under him. He would sit down to talk to Spruance and pull his feet up. Spruance would wrinkle his nose. "I wish you wouldn't put your feet on the furniture," he would say. "Why not? The deck is perfectly clean. It's just as clean as the chairs are." "I don't want my trousers to get all dirty sitting where you've had your feet," the Admiral would rejoin with asperity. Spruance tried one last time to save his Chief of Staff in a message to Admiral Jacobs, although all concerned knew that by the time matters reached the point of official correspondence, the decisions had all been made. On May 25th, Spruance and his staff went aboard the Indianapolis, which was his flagship for amphibious operations. This Mariana's move was to be again the biggest operation yet attempted in the Pacific. Nimitz commanded now fewer than 3 forces for this move: Spruance's 5th Fleet, Lockwood's submarines, and Calhoun's service force. As tactical commander, Spruance had his Joint Expeditionary Force under Kelly Turner, the fast carrier forces under Mark Mitcher, and the land-based aircraft under John Hoover. Turner, of course, had the landing and the protection of the landed forces. Holland Smith would ride with him on his command ship, and would be in overall command of the ground forces. The attack on Saipan and Tinian would be carried out by the 5th Amphibious Corps, which consisted of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, with reinforcements. It would come partly from Hawaii and partly from the west coast. The southern attack on Guam would be under Rear Admiral Richard Connolly. The landings would be made by Major General Roy Geiger of the Marines and the 3rd Amphibious Corps, which consisted of the 3rd Marine Division and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade. This unit was coming up from the Guadalcanal area. In reserve was Rear Admiral William H. P. Blandy with the 27th Division of the Army under Major General Ralph Smith. Some indication of the change in Nimitz's war can be gained from the size of this force: 535 ships carrying 127,500 troops, some of the vessels steaming from the United States to go into battle. As each operation of the past had been different from all the others, so was this Marianas invasion offering something new. It would be the first move in a large landmass, and if an island 6 miles by 14 miles did not seem a large landmass to the army troops, it certainly did to the Navy and the Marines. That was Saipan. All 3 islands had important airfields. All 3 were stoutly defended. All 3 were long-time possessions of Japan, which meant there were new loyalties to consider. In the planning, Holland, Smith and Turner had worked closely together, along with Harry Hill, who was Turner's second-in-command in the Northern Force. Once again, the speedy planning and execution of the Marianas operation saved many lives, for when Saipan, for example, was invaded, tough as the opposition was, it was still apparent that the Japanese had not been completely ready. Hill's forces found half-finished emplacements, a battery of 3 144 mm guns on railroad cars that could have done serious damage if they had been in operation, and 3 more 120 mm guns still packed in Cosmoline. The 500 ships were loaded with new weapons and new techniques. Underwater demolition teams of swimmers had been well trained to deal with beach mines and other defences since the Gilberts. With the tons of munitions and the thousands of men, Holland, Smith and Turner hoped to take the Marianas in 8 to 10 days. Almost up to the eve of departure, Smith was still revising his figures on the Japanese defenders, and he estimated that there were perhaps 15,000 defenders on Saipan. So much for estimates. There were actually about 32,000 troops there. Spruance's plan was to move in first with the 4 carrier task groups of Mitcher's fast carrier force and destroy the planes on Saipan, Tinian, Rota, Guam and Pagan. Next, Hoover's land-based planes would hit Truk, Wolai, Palau and Yap to prevent these Japanese bases from sending aid to the Marianas. The carriers, meanwhile, would move on up to the volcanoes to hit airfields and shipping at Iwo Jima and Chichijima. Long-range search planes and submarines would watch out for the Japanese fleet, which might be expected to come out and fight now that the Americans were invading the inner ring of defences of the Empire. The first move was to be made against Saipan after 2 days of bombardment. Guam would be next. Then would come Tinian, using the troops that had captured Saipan. While these landings were taking place, Spruance would be with the fighting forces of the 5th Fleet, looking for the Japanese to come out and engage. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had suggested in March that the Marianas operation would cut off the Japanese bases to the south from that air pipeline that had worked so well for so long. It would give the United States Navy an advanced naval base in these islands, bases for the B-29S, and a jumping-off place for any one of several operations next, which would keep the Japanese guessing and their forces deployed over a wide area. Spruance went to the marshals. All the other forces were also in motion or ready to go in motion to assemble off the Marianas. On June 6th, Spruance was steaming out in Indianapolis to join Mitcher's Task Force 58, when at dinner he had a radio message announcing that other invasion on the beaches of Normandy. That night he heard part of a broadcast in which President Roosevelt congratulated the generals for capturing Rome. On June 7th, Spruance was at Eniwetok, and he went ashore to stretch his legs. Then it was off to the war. The plan called for the airstrikes to begin on the Marianas on June 12th, but on the morning of the 11th, Japanese snoopers spotted the task force, and Mitchell asked for permission to send his strikes out that day. Spruance agreed. The hundreds of planes of the 15 carriers continued their aerial bombardment on June 12th, then the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, pulverizing Japanese aerial opposition. The only attempts to strike back came from a group of 10 bombers that appeared from Truk on June 12th and did no damage, and by 2 groups from Yap that came in on the 15th and did no damage either. On June 14th, Rear Admiral Clark's Task Group 58.1 and Rear Admiral Harrell's Task Group 58.4 were sent off to the volcanoes to neutralize those islands. Harrell was not eager to go, but Clark convinced him that they had that job to do. On June 13th, Spruance received word from the submarine Redfin that the Japanese fleet, stationed at Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines, had moved out, battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Much later on, Spruance had word from a submarine that Japanese battleships had sailed from Batyan in the Netherlands East Indies, bound for the Pacific. Whatever else might be said about Jocko Clark, commander of Task Group 58.1, he was a fighting admiral. He went after the Jemas with a vengeance, charging in at 25 knots to be sure he had enough time to knock them cold. His planes shot down 24 fighters over the islands and destroyed the troop-carrying transport Tatsutakawa Maru and worked over the airfields in the area. Meanwhile, 2 events were taking place. At Saipan, Admiral Turner was conducting his landing. Spruance had gone in to be where the action was on June 13th as the bombardment began. 8 old battleships, 11 cruisers, and 26 destroyers began hitting Saipan and Tinian at dawn on June 14th. Next day, the troops went into Saipan, but the bombardment had not been as successful as the Navy had hoped, and the defences on Saipan were very tough, so the going ashore was slow. It was so slow, in fact, that the 2nd and 4th Marines did not reach their first day's objective until the 3rd day of battle. The second event was the sortie of the Japanese fleet, moving into action for the first time in months. On June 15th, Spruance had word from the submarine Flying Fish. Out of San Bernardino Strait, the Japanese were moving a force of battleships, carriers, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. The report was made at 1900 hours. The course was 80 degrees, and the speed was 20 knots. An hour later, the submarine Seahorse reported a task force east of the Philippines, course 25 degrees, speed 16.5 knots. On June 16th, Spruance and his chief of staff took boat to Turner's flagship for a conference. They agreed that Turner would continue the unloading. On June 17th, all transports not urgently required would be withdrawn. The battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of the bombardment group would cover Saipan to the west, but the southern attack force was going to move east. Spruance was also going to take away some of the cruisers and destroyers that belonged to the expeditionary force and send them out with the fast carrier force. At the same time, Spruance ordered Hoover to send 6 patrol planes to Saipan, prepared to make night searches 600 miles out to the west. He ordered Mitchell to discontinue support operations at Saipan and to restrict the fast carrier air operations on June 17th to searches and to morning and afternoon neutralization strikes on Guam and Rota. Rear Admiral Reeves in Task Group 58.3 and Rear Admiral Montgomery in Task Group 58.2 were to rendezvous with the reinforcing units of the Expeditionary Force on the afternoon of June 17th. By the afternoon of June 17th, the task force was back together with Clark and Harrell back from the north. Mitchell and Ching Lee, the battleship commander, had the battle plan. The 6 battleships, along with cruisers and destroyers, constituted a separate task group. The battle plan was very simple. Our air will first attack our enemy carriers as operating carriers, then will attack enemy battleships and cruisers to slow or disable them. Task Group 58.7, fast battleships, will destroy enemy fleet, either by fleet action if enemy elects to fight, or by sinking slowed or crippled ships if enemy retreats. Actions against the retreating enemy must be pushed vigorously by all hands to ensure complete destruction of the fleet. Destroyers running short of fuel may be returned to Saipan if necessary for refueling. Spruance soon followed these orders with another dispatch to Mitchell and Lee. Desire you proceed at your discretion, selecting dispositions and movements best calculated to meet the enemy under the most advantageous conditions. I shall issue general directions when necessary, and leave details to you and Admiral Lee. In other words, Spruance's admirals were to run the show, unless he decided they were not doing it right. Only then would he step in. The Japanese were, indeed, moving out for a battle. Ever since Midway, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had wanted a chance to fight the American fleet, under conditions that the Japanese would choose. They had a plan, Operation Eigo, which called for bringing the American fleet to base south of the Palau-WWII line, where the Japanese surface fleet would have plenty of submarines and land-based air to help out. Later, the range was extended to include the Marianas. On June 11th, when the first carrier strike was authorized by Spruance, Admiral Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, realized that the Americans were moving on the Marianas, and he put the Eigo plan into operation. On June 12th, Admiral Toyoda ordered Admiral Ugaki to move from the Moluccas with the big battleships Yamato and Musashi, a handful of cruisers and many destroyers. Ugaki was to go northeast to the Philippine Sea, where he would meet with Admiral Ozawa, who would bring the main body of the mobile fleet. Ugaki's force was the one reported by the submarine Seahorse. Ozawa's movement was that reported by the submarines. The Japanese were moving, and Spruance was tracking them through the reports of the submarines. On the night of June 17th, the submarine Kavala reported 15 or more large combat ships, moving east at 20 knots, some 700 miles west of Guam. And so the enemies were converging. The two Japanese forces had joined and were coming fast to do battle and avenge Midway. But how different were the odds? This time it was 9 Japanese carriers to 15 American carriers, 430 Japanese carrier planes to 819 American planes, 5 Japanese battleships to 7 fast new American battleships, 13 Japanese cruisers to 21 American cruisers, 28 Japanese destroyers to 69 American destroyers. On the night of June 17th, Spruance did not know that the Japanese units had joined. Neither did Jocko Clark, who was just joining up. Clark, however, considered taking Harrell and steaming to the southwest all night, thus placing himself between the Japanese fleet and their base. He called Harrell on the TBS and talked it over, but Harrell said his orders were to stick with the task force, and he moved off without further ado. Clark had nearly 350 planes of his own, and he considered going it alone. Had he done so, he would have been either the hero of the battle or the goat. He did not. He joined up and contented himself with criticizing Spruance for not understanding how carriers could be used. Spruance considered the angles. He asked Ching Lee if he wanted a night engagement with the battleships. Lee, who was uncertain of the night training of his ships and of their ability to stay in formation under fire, was emphatic in his statement that he did not want a night engagement. Spruance decided to behave very much as he had at Midway. "In my opinion," he told Lee and Mitchell by message, "the main attack will come from the west, but might be diverted to come from the southwest. Diversionary attacks could come from either flank or from the Empire. Task Force 58 must cover Saipan and the forces engaged there, and this can be done best by proceeding west in daylight and towards Saipan at night. Consider it unwise to seek a night engagement in view of our superiority, but earliest possible strike on enemy carriers is necessary." As a tactician, Spruance knew that the Japanese tended to split their forces. Their carrier doctrine called for a split in forces, and this had been reaffirmed by a document found in the South Pacific, a plan captured at Hollandia, which he had received just before sailing on this operation. On June 18th, the Kavala reported a force of 15 ships zigzagging on a course of 90 degrees at 19 knots. This led Spruance to believe there were still two forces. That afternoon, Kavala again reported that the ships were coming, but still outside the search area. The carriers were operating, and because of the need to head eastward into the wind, they made only 112 miles west between noon and 2000 hours. On that night of the 18th, Hoover's shore-based planes began searching 600 miles out to the west, starting at 2300 hours. That night, too, Nimitz sent a message reporting a direction finder fix on an enemy transmission at 2023 hours, 585 miles out from Saipan, at 257 degrees, correct within 100 miles. Mitcher wanted to change course, heading west, in order to be in a position to launch at 0500. Spruance did not believe the fix. He did believe in Japanese strategy, and fully expected an end run. Here was the point that was to become the basis for endless argument. Jocko Clark stated one position succinctly. If carriers are properly utilized, he said, it is not possible for surface ships to make an end run around them. A great opportunity to smash the Japanese fleet was lost. Here was Spruance's reasoning. The position of the direction finder fix was not definite, being within 100 miles. The originator of the transmission was not definitely known. The size and composition of the force was not known. It was important to guard against a circling movement. The transmission could possibly be from a decoy. A Stingray, submarine transmission, had been hammed at 23:46 hours, indicating that Stingray might be in contact 175 miles ESE of the direction finder fix. The transmission was in fact real, and it was to the Japanese shore-based aircraft, verifying that they were to go into action with the Japanese fleet. But no one in Spruance's fleet knew this. Spruance really believed there were two forces operating. To add to this conviction, there came a report from the submarine Finback of searchlights at still another position. Were there 3 Japanese forces out? It was not inconceivable. To add to Spruance's problem, the Japanese knew who, what, and where he was. The American force had been trailed all day on June 18th by land-based aircraft. Jocko Clark and many other aviators have since held that a great opportunity to smash the Japanese fleet was lost. So have a number of naval historians. The difference between the aviators and the historians is that the aviators said it at the time, and the historians have been armed with something neither Spruance, Mitcher, nor anyone else had on June 18th, knowledge of the nature and elements of the Japanese forces. Strange things happen in battle. In a sense, the American superiority over the Japanese at this point was analogous to the Japanese superiority over the Americans at Midway, considering skills and outmoded planes. Spruance could be criticized for not going aggressively after the Japanese fleet. Halsey most certainly would have done so. But had he done so and lost, he would have been ruined, and the Marianas invasion might have failed. He took the position that his primary task was to effect the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. He would wait for the Japanese fleet to come to him. The way Togo waited at Tsushima for the Russian fleet to come to him has always been in my mind, Spruance wrote later. Early on the morning of June 19th, Nimitz at Pearl Harbor had a report from a PBM based at Saipan, one of those planes of Hoover's that Spruance had ordered out on the 600-mile sweeps, which showed 40 ships in 2 groups about 75 miles northeast of that radio direction finder fix that Spruance distrusted. The trouble was that something slipped somewhere, and although Pearl Harbor had the information, Spruance did not get it for 8 hours. Nimitz then knew more at Pearl Harbor about the movements of the Japanese than Spruance did. Given Nimitz's knowledge, Spruance probably would have moved west at 0130 in the morning and been in a position to strike the Japanese fleet at dawn. But there was the luck factor. He did not have the information. At 0715 in the morning, a combat air patrol from the Belleau Wood moved toward Guam when the fighter director saw bogies on his radar screen in that direction, and the planes looked down on the island to see enemy airplanes taking off from the fields. Since those fields had been worked over very heavily on June 17th and 18, the planes must have come from somewhere else. They might have been reinforcements flown up from as far away as Truk. They might be carrier planes landing to refuel. Anyhow, Admiral Mitcher then ordered a sweep over Guam, and nearly a dozen Japanese planes were shot down. Around 0850 on the morning of June 19th, that delayed dispatch from the PBM finally reached Spruance, and at long last he had the true picture as of 0130 in the morning. Mitcher immediately recalled the fighters from Guam and stopped the launch of Harrell's Task Group 58.4. The fighters were pulled back to the environs of the task groups. Still, there were problems of interpretation. As Moore recalls, a supplementary report of the enemy force indicated that it was in two groups, one of about 30 ships and the other of about 10. In trying to analyse this 1:15 report from the patrol plane, with the other contact reports that we'd had earlier in the evening, it was indicated that the force reported by the patrol plane might have been a concentration of all the groups of Japanese vessels that were operating to westward of us, or it might have been, 1, the concentration of 2 or more groups, or it might still have been, 2, a single group. So it didn't really mean an awful lot even then, but it didn't preclude the possibility of a flanking movement, either to the north or south, as well as a movement in from the westward. That second report had come from the same search plane and had been picked up by Jocko Clark's communications section, then relayed to Mitcher, then to Spruance. At 1,000 hours, the radar picked up a large bogey bearing 265 degrees, about 125 miles away, heading in from the west. It was apparent that this represented a Japanese carrier airstrike. Mitcher recalled all fighters to defend their carriers, and sent the dive bombers and torpedo planes off the carriers to orbit east of Guam, thus freeing the decks to launch, land, and service fighters only. At 1004, the carriers sounded general quarters, and 450 F-6F Hellcat fighters took off, along with a few F-4U night fighters, to intercept the Japanese. Japanese Admiral Ozawa was undertaking a daring operation. On the evening of June 17th, Ozawa knew very well what he was up against. He knew that 2 carrier groups had attacked Chichijima and Iwo Jima on June 15th and 16. He knew that 2 other carrier groups were refueling. He knew that the landing force on Saipan had its own escort carriers. He also thought he knew what Spruance would do. The Japanese had captured documents that showed that Mitcher was in command of Task Force 58. The Japanese had interrogated captured aviators and discovered that Spruance was in command of the whole fleet. Ozawa knew his American admirals, and on Spruance's record, Ozawa inferred that the American would behave as he had at Midway, not moving west of the Marianas, but waiting for the Japanese to come to him. In almost every way, the Japanese fleet was inferior to the American, except in one way that might count for very much on this day. All the way along, the Japanese had sacrificed pilot safety for range and maneuverability in their planes. Nimitz and King had steadfastly refused to follow suit, guided by the American concern for personnel. The American planes had self-sealing gas tanks and heavy armor. Consequently, their outward range from their carrier was limited to about 350 miles, while the Japanese range was 550 miles. The Japanese, then, could attack at least 3 hours before the Americans in almost any given situation, for, even with bomb loads, the Japanese planes had a range of about 100 more miles outward than the Americans. Admiral Ozawa had another advantage. In the days of fighting sail, it was called the lee gauge, meaning that Ozawa was travelling against the wind. In steam, the lee gauge meant little, but in carrier operations, it was back again to the days of sail. In reverse, for a carrier could launch and recover planes handily while proceeding against the wind, and Ozawa had the eastern trade wind against him. Ozawa believed he had another vital advantage, the help of 500 land-based planes. But here Vice Admiral Kakuta, commander of Ozawa's land-based air in the Marianas, had played his superior false by not revealing the damage done by the American airstrikes to his forces. Instead of 500 land-based planes, he had practically none. On June 18th, the Japanese had made a tactical attempt, which might go down in Japanese naval history with as much controversy as Spruance's decision to stay close to the Marianas. Rear Admiral Obayashi, commander of a division of 3 carriers and a Jocko Clark type, decided on his own initiative to launch a strike against Spruance, on the basis of a report from a search plane that had found the American force 420 miles out. He had actually put planes in the air for the strike when he received a new operations order from Ozawa, ordering the mobile fleet to retire temporarily, spend the night, and then hit the Americans first thing in the morning. Admiral Obayashi called his planes back. Had they gone out with the intention of striking in the evening and then landing at Guam, they might have done very serious damage. Perhaps this was Japan's lost opportunity. The most interesting aspect to the chess game as of the night of June 18, 19, was that the Japanese air operations were so much more successful than those of the Americans, in terms of search and the passage of information to the commander of the force. The superior searching of the Japanese had given them a definite advantage. Jocko Clark, quick to criticize Spruance for caution, might have examined the responsibility of the carrier search forces and how they carried it out. Morrison has suggested, WWII, P-245, that the air search might have contributed a good deal more to the American effort on June 18th, when the Japanese might have been found.